Thank you, my friend.
Not a problem.
All right, so Kevin, I want to just interview you about a little bit about you and you're running for office. Is that right?
Rolling for office.
You're rolling for office. That is right.
Right.
All right, so let's just start off. So, Anine, this is Winona Laduke, our show Aba Say, and I am visiting here with Kevin Shore.
Shores.
Kevin Shores,
Sorry.
there's more than one shore.
Yes, it's plural.
Shores. Pleased to meet you again, Kevin. And I've known you a pretty long time, and you're quite an interesting fellow. And we're going to start with what you are doing right now, which is rolling. You're rolling for office.
Well, that chapter, I guess, just ended because the election was on the 5th of November, and I was rolling for the position of mayor of Moorhead, and it was my third time trying.
And so, why did you run for this office?
Well, I've kind of been an activist most of my life. My name, NeSe for short, in Anishinaabe, means maker of loud noise. What I was told by Porky White, my Niijii, and it's kind of been my personality my whole life. I always spoke my mind, and sometimes at a strong cost, but I always kind of stuck up for the underdog and just wanted things to be better. I joked about wanting to save the world, and then when I had children, I realized I needed to save the world. And so when I moved up to Moorhead back in '99, with the whole intentions of going to Moorhead State to get my teacher's degree and finishing my BA in Native American Studies, and my original plans were to move to the reservation and teach Anishinaabe studies. And moving here, I fell in love and liked Moorhead, and a gentleman, Mark Voxlin, was running for office, and he was unopposed. And I was just bewildered.
So you run for office up here, and no one runs against you. There's not a it's not a two-party system or anything, huh?
Well, the Mark Voxlin was running unopposed.
Yeah.
And so it's like, somebody, please, anybody, run against this guy, give us a choice. So I called up City Hall and I asked them, what does it take to run for mayor? And they said $5. And I asked, what time does your office close? And I rolled up to City Hall and put my name down and paid my $5. And then all of a sudden, two other people came and did the same thing. And ironically enough, it was the day before 9/11 that I signed up. And it was quite interesting because along with the regular rhetoric, I was bringing up the which people usually don't talk about, the harder issues, not well, you've been involved with politics, you know how they kind of go with the same arguments time after
It's like
time.
when people say, I'm in favor of education. I'm like, what's that mean?
Right. Like you've never been in favor and you just changed your mind now,
Right,
so...
or I believe in jobs. Me too, We believe in all those things, right?
Right.
And so but you ran, and so what were some of the issues that you brought up?
Community. I am very, very much in favor with community. I mean, I think that is the backbone of our people as Anishinaabe, and it should be the backbone of the dominant society. And it seems like everywhere you turn, there's people and corporations and whatnot consistently trying to divide us. And that, I fear, is once we're divided, then we're easily controlled. And it's kind of like the battle of our ancestors, where they separated all the tribes instead of letting the tribes be unity, and they broke us, or broke them, our ancestors.
I believe it was Tecumseh, wasn't one of the great leaders who said we all had to unite, and kind of for our neck of the woods being the Algonquin speakers, and then of course Sitting Bull, let us put our minds together and see what kind of a future we can make for our children, right?
Absolutely. And I always ponder, where would we be in the United States had they embraced the Native Americans and take on some of their teachings, but there was such a challenge because our people, we don't believe in hoarding things and keeping things, we believe in sharing. And that concept just blew the settlers away, why are you giving? And it's like, the whole thing in our language, how we don't have a word for you're welcome, because it was just known that you gave.
I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, but, arguably, things like American democracy, people came to this country and all they had was experience with feudalism and monarchy. And, the Europeans who came didn't have an experience of democracy, but it was the Iroquois Confederacy, right?
Right. Well, it was the Anishinaabe too, were part of that because we weren't really battling amongst each other until the Manifest Destiny and the whole movement towards the Western. But wasn't it Thomas Paine in his books about utopia, where utopia was first coined? He based that off of his dealings with the Native Americans of North America.
So part of what you're saying, if I'm hearing you, and I think I get you, is that are you telling me that like an indigenous thinking person adds something to like a mayoral campaign or to civil society because we're not, if we're thinking in an indigenous mind, we're not thinking like maybe the rest of the people?
Yeah, that's summarizing it, But I just think that because I was, if I preface it with growing up, I called myself a concrete engine. I was raised down in the Twin Cities, and I'm pigmentally challenged, and so I easily blended into the dominant society.
Pigmentally challenged means you're kind of fair-skinned?
Right,
That's
right.
funny.
And so I remember, coming up to the reservation and going to the powwows and going to birthday parties. And I remember times crying because I was so pale. Like, why are all my cousins, this is my family, and I'm so pale, and they were so dark. But then by the end of the summer, I got a nice tan. So it was known by the end of the summer I was native. But I remember one time in Indianapolis, where I lived for a short 4 years, that we were walking downtown, and the buddies I was with, white guys, and they pointed out to some natives, and they said, "Oh, look at those prairie niggers." And I was like appalled. Like, I didn't know what to say because here I am, Native American, and it's like, now am I racist by being offended by that because I'm going to get mad because they're using a derogatory term already, but then they're using it against my people, my ancestry. So it was just mind-boggling to realize that these friends of mine had no idea I was Native. And then I told them, I said, I'm Native. And then it turned into like, oh, no, not your Native people. And it's like, well, what's the
Was that like 'cause
difference?
you're a good Indian or what?
Right, exactly. And yeah, so I remember reading all the books about being a really book smart Indian, and then
Wait. Tell me, what are the books that book smart Indians are supposed to read, just so I make sure I
oh my
study up here?
God,
Like, is that like God is Red?
right,
Right? All
right,
the Vine Deloria books, right?
yes, yes, and oh geez,
Bury
what
My Heart
was
at
it?
Wounded Knee.
Medicine and Moccasins. But
I missed that one. Uh-oh.
I did.
I better read Tony Troyer's new book that's out, right? Everything You Want to Know About Indians But We're Afraid to Ask, or isn't that what it's called?
I have not. I heard he came out with a new one, but I
Yeah.
didn't know. Nice. I'll check it out. Or the Thomas Peacock with his Bimad Disease. What was it? Bimad Disease way we had?
Or
No,
the
no. Was.
Wasa Benadada,
Right.
yeah.
That one.
Which is looking all around. That's like an Ojibwe history book. Wasa Benadada.
Right. But I do have challenge with the Bering Straits theory because it's still called a theory. And I guess if you would take the time to, if anyone would take the time to look upon that theory, it would fall apart like a 200-year-old or a 20,000-year-old native basket.
Well, I always think about that because originally they kind of dated us, and then I know that over on the north side of Detroit Lakes, that they found an archaeological thing. Though there, guys put in his basement, and they found, I think it was a 7,000-year-old ancestor with a copper spear point in his hip. And I was like, no, it wasn't like on his hip; it was like in his hip, right?
Right, right.
And so that copper spear point was not from here; it had been from Michigan.
Right.
And so that means that I guess that some of our old people were around quite a while ago and quite a far ways from the Bering Strait, huh?
Well, even if you, Neshomas book, you know, which I think is a wonderful...
Eddie Benton, another must-read if you're a reading Indian. Or it's probably a must-read, period.
Yeah, I would agree with that one. That's a really good opener, especially for the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people. But, you know, even if you go to the Smithsonian and you argue about the copper scrolls that were used prevalently before the birch bark scrolls, that the birch bark scrolls were used because of the transportation factor, how much easier it is to carry around birch bark scrolls than copper scrolls. And there's argument that the Smithsonian still has our copper scrolls.
Right, I didn't even know about the copper scrolls.
Well, I'm humbled that I've shared something
stumped
new to
me.
you.
You stumped me, man. I know they got our big copper boulder, the Ontonagon boulder. It's 2,800 or 3,000 pounds, and it's sitting over there by an elevator shaft because structurally, the museum cannot support it. I was like, way to keep it.
Of course.
Keep it because you need it.
But then being a book smart Indian, I really didn't understand it. And I was raised Lutheran. And one day I told my father I didn't want to go to church anymore because of witnessing the hypocrisy there at the church. And so I never doubted there was the existence of a creator or God, you know, at all. I just didn't agree with some of the teachings where, you know, you have to have short hair and then you learn of Jesus being long-haired, and it was just conflicting to me, and so I stopped. And then after I got out of the military, I felt empty, and I started researching religions. And
you felt religiously or spiritually empty?
Spiritually empty, yeah. And so then I started doing research, you know, of all these thousands of religions, which ones could be right. And so I started looking for, well, what's the oldest? And then I started looking into the ancient Babylons. You know, we're looking at 7,000 years of written history, and like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you know, just ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets or writing scrolls. And then I all of a sudden was like, well, what about my ancestry? And I started researching how long our ancestry has been on here. They're still arguing. There's some claims that we've been here 70,000 years in North America.
Some old Indians down in South America that are 40,000 years old, and over at Chesapeake Bay they got stuff. And that's a long ways from that old Bering, huh?
Right, right. There's a wonderful book out there called Forbidden Archaeology by Michael Cremo. That throughout there he has examples of archaeological. You know, it was against the normalcy to go against the church, you know, as an archaeologist. So your hands were tied by the dogma of these archaeologists that weren't being able to write their findings. That
Are you telling me because they didn't want a different origin story than that which was in the Bible?
Well, that would conflict with the estimated 12,000-year-old Earth theory that's been presented by a lot of my Christian friends.
Oh, okay.
And so, you know, you don't want to go, you got to go along to get along if you want to get along in the North American dominant society way, I guess.
You know what, Kevin, I have to be honest, I think I missed this because I wasn't raised Christian.
Oh,
I didn't know that it was 12,000 years old. That kind of stumps that thing on old mastodons and all that, huh?
right, right. Well, this was where I was so pleased when you start learning of the Anishinaabe language and you start learning that they have words for the giant sea otter
Right.
or the woolly mammoth or the saber-toothed tiger. And these are all animals that were 120,000 years ago in the Pleistocene, or I'm mispronouncing that, Pleistocene
Old school.
era, old,
They're
long,
old school.
old time ago.
Yeah.
And
Minwenja, I think is how you say it in Anishinaabe moment. Minwenja, long time ago.
yeah, yeah, and so how does that go with the Bering Straits theory in school, which I taught, or not which I taught, which I was taught, and so all this conflict. So then I started going to ceremonies, and and also at the same time I got sick with Gulf War illness because
So we're going to finish up a little bit on this on religion and spirituality, but then I do want to talk a little bit about Gulf War. Is that okay?
sure.
And so you began to remember your spiritual traditions. Is that what you're?
Well, after I got out of the military and after going through my life without a religion or spirituality, although not being, not being atheist or any of that, when I started researching my ancestry, then I started asking elders and then going to a sweat lodge. And I went to my first sweat lodge, and I remember going into the lodge, and the flaps were pulled down, and the elder started his rattle and his drum and sing, and he said these songs were passed on from my father to his father, and started beating the drum and singing a song, and it literally felt like my cells at the molecular structure of my body, like all of a sudden perked their ears and said, "This is it." And I bawled and wept and put my face in the earth, and I never felt so connected in my life. It was the most enlightening, euphoric feeling I ever had. And I knew from that moment on that I am Anishinaabe and Niijii. And that's what I started making the claim. I am Anishinaabe. I started seeking out elders and going and asking for teachings, and things just fell into place. At one point, I was awarded a pipe, and I received my Anishinaabe name or Ojibwe name, and it just seemed right. And so then, oh, I'm sorry.
So what year is this about? We're talking about.
Oh,
93?
Yeah, about 93,
I'm
94.
shooting for dates here.
Right, right. Yeah, that'd be a good guess.
And so you were able to find something that was really important to you.
Absolutely.
And so, I want to talk about that because, how I came to know you quite a long time ago. And I remember that you had just returned from the war. And so you're a Gulf War vet.
Well, no, actually, I'm a Kuwaiti oil crisis vet. And I met you at the Minneapolis. Well, I met you before, even before when you ran for office or when you went for vice presidency with Ralph Nader.
I also have not won an election, okay? So I'm with you.
Right.
I'm with you, Kevin.
And I remember I did a ride. It was right after I did my ride across the state of Minnesota in my wheelchair that someone from the Nader campaign heard about it and wanted me to come and meet Ralph Nader and you. And I was like, I know Winona. And because we're from the same res, Well, I wasn't born there, but it's the res, and things on the res. And so I know of you, and I think we actually have met at powwows prior. But the one that I really remember is there at the Ralph Nader during the Minneapolis campaign stop you guys did.
So
And
that
we,
was, yeah, that was 2000, I think, as that was. I don't know if we did one in 96, but I remember 2000 for sure. But so, Kevin, what I want to talk a little bit about is spirituality and then the lessons that you have. I mean, so I came to know you. You say you're a
Kuwaiti oil crisis.
and so tell me why you call yourself that. And I know that the military has had a severe impact on you.
Well, I was on a ship when I joined the military. I went on a ship out of San Diego, California, the USS Fox CG-33. And we won the Battle E, which was just a prestige award for being the most efficient class of ship that you are. And so we were graced by going on a world tour. And so we went to, we were on our way to the Mediterranean. And on our way there, the USS Stark, a frigate in the Gulf, got hit by an Iraqi missile. And it killed 33 lives, or 32. 32 or 33, I'm sorry. And they called us on a captain's call, and we all went to the flight deck, and the captain said, we're going into the Persian Gulf. There's been a crisis. And
So that's a big difference from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf.
Absolutely.
Mediterranean sounds kind of like a cruise.
Right, right.
Persian Gulf doesn't sound like a cruise anymore.
114 degrees for like 4 days in a row. Being a Minnesota boy and loving all the seasons, but yeah, it's hot. And, they put in this absolute fear into us because I think we even had lawyers coming on board before we went that way to, if people wanted to sign wills. I remember that we were all talking about, do we need wills because of what just happened? So we go into the Persian Gulf, and we were escorting Kuwaiti oil crisis. We were there to help liberate the Kuwaitis by making sure their oil got through the Straits of Hormuz because Saddam was threatening to blow them out of the water. And so after that
And
oil...
that was oil that was going to us, or?
Well, our union...
Europe, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're escorting the oil tankers, and then we leave Kuwait. But also before we go there, we get inoculations. And then we get back. I'm out of the military. I'm in the reserves. And then all of a sudden I start getting sick. And I go to the VA, and they say, you're fine. And they give me a low-dose Motrin pain reliever. And I do this for a couple years. And then I get to a point where I could barely walk. And I went to the VA, and this is just at the ending of the Persian Gulf War. And so I go to the VA, and they run me through a gauntlet of tests, and they diagnose me with rheumatoid variant disease, which is a fancy name for an unknown arthritic condition. And it eventually put me in a wheelchair. And so I started investigating why I'm sick. And an individual tells me about the American Gulf War Veterans Association, and a woman was lecturing in Wisconsin and said he'd take me to it if I wanted to go. So we went, and this woman described the exact progression that I went through with my illness. All the symptoms I matched and everything. And at the end of it, I went up to her and I said, hey, you just described exactly what I'm going through. And she said, were you in the Gulf War? And I said, no, but I was in the Gulf. And then her face just kind of went blank, and she told me that more and more veterans were coming up to her that never were in the Gulf War and are just as sick. And then that started my whole crusade with Gulf War illness.
Okay, so just for those who are listening in, I'm talking to Kevin Shores here, and we're in his home in Moorhead, and now we're talking a little bit about his military history. And thank you for joining us here on Niijii Radio. But Kevin, what I want to say is like, I know that a lot of people, like Native Americans have the highest rate of enlistment, and we have the highest rate of living veterans, right? And
Right.
The United States is the largest military power. The United States military is the single largest polluter in the world, it turns out, for whether you're going to talk about nuclear testing in the Pacific or in Nevada. And, for those, I got kind of picky about this because I wrote a book called The Militarization of Indian Country. But we have this huge number of veterans, and I think I'm basically someone who doesn't support the wars, but I love my people, and a lot of guys like you end up in the military, and I don't hate them. But what's kind of it bothers me because I think that what we look at is these guys go over for a set of reasons. Sometimes it's economic, right? Sometimes it's because they think they are helping their country. Sometimes they think that they're going and helping another country that's in duress, right?
Right.
And they do a tour of duty and they come back and I think in the Gulf War there was a lot of gassing. Isn't that a lot of what it was?
Well, that's the claims.
I know there was sarin gas.
Yep. It was provenly used by both sides, supposedly and allegedly. But they were telling us that originally it was we as Americans weren't used to breathing in the fine dust in desert air. And then they told us there were mites or bugs in the sand. And then they told us it was...
Like sand fleas or something?
Right. And then they were saying it was Saddam using biological weapons. And then there was claims that we were using biologicals. And there was, if you investigate the Camden bunker complex that was blown up in the Middle East, it was allegedly the size of 4 super Walmarts. And they were filled with biological and chemical weapons. And surprisingly enough, they had made in the good old USA stamped on them.
Wait.
And
so
made in...
The weapons that they found, and these were allegedly weapons that belonged to who?
Us.
But it was a U.S. chemical weapons cache.
Well, it was purchased during Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein when they were chums, that Saddam Hussein bought biological weapons from us in the mid-'80s. And not only us, but Great Britain or the United Kingdom and other countries around the world. So they found all of these ammunitions and they destroyed it. The largest demolition of ammunitions in the U.S. history.
And where was this?
In Iraq.
In Iraq.
From the first Gulf War.
Okay, and so they destroy this, and I know that it's kind of tricky to destroy something like that, I bet.
Oh, yeah. There's Daniel Paulson, I believe, was the demolition expert that came out and had Gulf War illness also, or claimed that he had Gulf War illness. And he had the videotape where they show it. You could probably find it on Google or YouTube now, that I'm sure you could probably find it. Just Camden bunker complex, Daniel Paulson, and it shows footage of walking through this warehouse of all of this ammunitions, and they blew it up. And the claim after that point was that from them blowing up that complex, it released biological weapons into the air, and that was getting the veterans sick.
And so, this is not a good thing.
Nah.
And so you're talking about exposing 10,000 men and women. I don't even know how many people were.
Well,
a lot of people.
In 2002, the number was 400,000 veterans in the United States were complaining of strange ailments and diseases. Over 40,000 were dead. And it was barely touched upon in the news.
Well, I know that they talk about the Gulf War syndrome.
Right.
And the syndrome makes it sound kind of inexact.
Mm-hmm. Right. But that's a necessary, necessary tactic of the government, because if it's absolutely proven that they were giving us experimental inoculations or even blowing up chemical bunkers to cause us to be sick, that's a lot of money to give veterans, to give them adequate care and adequate help.
So for those who are listening, the Vietnam era, it was Agent Orange.
Right.
Right.
Dioxides.
And dioxin.
Yep.
And so there was a huge number of veterans that were exposed to that. arguably we could say that the U.S. military didn't fully know the impact on humans, but they certainly knew that they were going to deforest a country, right?
Right. They knew it would kill everything green,
And
yet
so
it would be fine for the veterans.
right. And, I mean, and I think a lot of people would say they're not sure that that's actually, I don't know the government's knowledge on it. And I think that there's, but it's kind of like, in the case of blowing up all of these chemical weapons, they must have known at some level that those were pretty dangerous because they were, after all, chemical weapons. They weren't defoliants, right?
Right. You would hope. But unfortunately, once the finger was being pointed at the inoculations that we were given, I've actually have seen shot records where an individual had the word. When you get a shot record, they put the date in, they do the batch, and then they give kind of a little description. Well, in the description column of this veteran, it was stamped secret. And I was under the impression, under the Geneva Convention, that it's against the law of the world to not use anybody as an experimental guinea pig without their consent.
Did the U.S. sign that, though? I don't actually know. Interesting question because of things that you get. I mean, a lot of...
I cannot remember that.
You-
That is a good question.
All right, we'll have to check on that one. But, okay, so basically you're saying, you've had a lot of health conditions that have resulted, as have hundreds of thousands of veterans, from Gulf War exposures to chemical weapons.
Right.
But you're saying that was also combined with inoculations.
Oh, absolutely. How else would the veterans that were never in the Persian Gulf, why would they be getting exactly the same sickness and symptoms?
And so what kind of inoculations were those?
Well, as the veterans in the audience would attest to, that when you join the military, your first couple weeks and throughout your military experience, they'll say, go to sick bay, and you either say which arm or which cheek.
So a lot.
Yeah.
Intended theoretically to make you avoid illness, right?
Right. That's the assumption of it.
But in this case, clearly not.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of, and I know that it's the United States military has a huge number of veterans, and that the VA is a bit overwhelmed. And there's more and more veterans, and increasingly now with Gulf War veterans coming back and Iraqi veterans coming back, a lot more of those guys are coming back with traumatic injuries. I just heard some stories about that, and those traumatic injuries, the military isn't prepared to deal with the level of people who are living with traumatic injuries, right?
Right. Oh, especially the vets coming back now. It's, if you look in the whole use of the depleted uranium in the weapons back then, and then if you read about that and the weapons having radiation on it, and when the weapons would use, they would basically disintegrate, so all this powderized radiation is left in Iraq. And basically Iraq right now is a nuclear waste field because of the wars that have been occurring there.
So, in most wars, I know that the figure for small arms is that I believe it is 9 out of 10 casualties are actually civilian. Because you've got political. No, it's 4 out of 5 casualties are civilian. Excuse me. But, so what you have is you have a political war between two sovereign nations that, is for a purpose. And we may disagree with the purpose, but there was a reason that those two countries, one an aggressor and one a defendant, or one are both aggressors, whatever, right?
Right.
And then you have the militaries that are engaged, but then there's the people who live there. And in something like the DU, it's what you're talking about,
right.
The depleted uranium, because it is a huge amount of depleted uranium, and it doesn't disappear, because uranium is by itself, it is radioactive, meaning it's got a half-life for 10,000 years or so.
Right.
And so it's not people who are perpetrators of the military, or of these evil acts that are affected by it, but it's in fact actually Iraqi civilians.
1 million children deaths from stillborns and deformities in the last 10 years
That's in Iraq.
in Iraq
Yeah.
from the depleted, they believe the cause is the depleted uranium. Not to exclude them themselves and the civilians complaining of Gulf War illness, which may possibly go back to where the government claims that it's the biological and chemical weapons.
So,
So,
I mean, the fact is that the militarization has a pretty big toll beyond the political fallout. There's an environmental and a health fallout.
oh, absolutely.
And, you know, we see some of it. You got a big VA hospital here in Fargo. You got a bigger, is the one in St. Cloud larger?
I've never been there, so I couldn't tell you.
And certainly, you know, people should have a right to health care. But a lot of this, you know, is you know, was not direct hits on people, right?
Right, right. You know, and if we go back to like the teaching of our ancestors, with the 500-year treaty with the Buon people, or Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people. So, you know, maybe if they would listen to us better or follow our democracy to the T, then maybe we wouldn't have so many wars.
Yeah, war's not a particularly healthy thing. Well, we're going to take a little break for a station ID here, and then I want to get back and talk to you about some other issues. But, you know, again, talking to Kevin Shores here, a veteran, tribal member, a human, recent candidate, third time, mayoral candidate for the Moorhead City Council, Moorhead Mayor. And, you know, pretty interesting fellow, and I just wanted a chance to talk to him, and I saw his darn face in the paper, his lovely face in the paper, and I was like, I'm going to get over and talk to that guy. So thanks again. We'll take a little pause here and be right back. We're making a leap of faith that we did really well there.
Yeah.
I thought you sounded fabulous. Do you think you feel okay about it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, our food's here. You want to have... Winona Laduke back here with Kevin Shores. We were talking about the Gulf War. It was a syndrome, and then at a certain time they realized what happened to the military to declare that they actually had a problem?
2008, the Department of Defense came out and said, yes, there is such a thing as Gulf War illness, which was good for me because I've been ostracized by my family, being ex-military and that they would make claims of how dare I make claims that our government would use us as experimental guinea pigs when you look at the history of the first known biological warfare was the smallpox blankets.
And then, well, then there's that movie, the second version was with Denzel Washington, wasn't it? The Manchurian Candidate?
Right.
I mean, which is a little bit, we could say if you're a conspiracy theorist, but, you know, it's pretty much popular knowledge, you know, our popular culture. We'll go with that, right?
Right. Well,
and that's psychotropic drugs, right?
Oh, absolutely, with the use of the MK Ultra and the behavior modification and mind control programs. That was the Manchurian Candidate. And then the LSD in California, where they were watching by giving people LSD and then recording how they would react on it.
All right, I remember a Scientific American journal when I was a kid, which was a few decades ago, but I remember that, you know, the weirdest thing was that they studied a spider on different drugs. They had him like on marijuana, and they had him on LSD, they had him on cocaine, and then they had him on caffeine. And the weirdest drug with this spider was caffeine. They're like with the LSD, they're like webs like trailed off, you know, and in the caffeine one, it was like this big knot of nothing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I always laugh, you know, because I mean, that's my drug of choice, caffeine.
Right.
It's done me well for years. And
well, even with the movie Reefer Madness that came out about, you know, the devil's weed, and look at the psychological implications on that movie where they showed all the supposedly cool kids were using marijuana. and the so-called like nerds and the socially awkward individuals were straight-laced, and so you didn't have fun unless you were using marijuana. But then they threw in that authoritarian and that doctor with the coat that you will go insane if you use the devil's weed or something of that.
Well, I don't know if that's true, actually. I don't know. I know that you could get dementia from a lot of things, and I heard the latest is, try to drink a glass of red wine a day, and it'll reduce your chance of dementia. They didn't say anything about don't take any marijuana, right?
Right, right.
I know, but not that many people do smoke. But this is kind of a perfect segue, and so thank you. You've saved me from trying to introduce this subject. I'm sitting here interviewing Kevin Shores, and he's wearing some hemp pants, but he corrected me and said that these are cannabis pants. Is that correct?
Right.
Is that a cannabis shirt too?
Correct.
Nice.
Actually, it's a blend, so it's not 100% cannabis.
Nice looking outfit. Is that illegal, your shirt and pants?
I guess if you tried to smoke it, it may be.
Yeah, but I mean, so there's this multi-million-dollar, I think it's probably in the billion-dollar hemp industry that is worldwide, because it turns out that hemp is like very versatile, from basically hemp seed oil. Hemp is a nutritional base. Hemp is what they made the sails out of for the, founding fathers and the Mayflower and the Santa Maria, and what was the other one, the Nina?
The USS Constitution had 25 tons of hemp, from ropes to sails to uniforms or to pitch on it. So the number right now, well, actually this is 3 years ago, 65,000 byproducts that can be made from the cannabis plant. Now, if you think about this, take a look around. Everything around us right now, as long as it's not glass or steel, can be made from the cellulose of the cannabis plant.
Okay, but this is something I've been obsessing on myself lately, because I am not a fan of the fossil fuels industry.
Not at all.
But everything that surrounds us is now a petroleum, quote, byproduct. And we've become people who are accustomed to that. Everything, they're sticking it in our body, right?
Right.
To park benches, to bags. And so the petroleum byproducts
Toys.
has become an essential thing. But a good portion of that could actually be made out of hemp.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With the Henry Ford actually had a fleet of 30 automobiles, personal cars, that were everything that could be made from cannabis was made from cannabis.
Really?
Yeah. And there's even an image where they show a gentleman striking the back trunk cover, and it bounces back, of how durable it is.
So they made a car out of hemp, basically.
Basically.
All right.
Right.
So this is a very, very versatile plant. It is, and it grows in kind of a wide variety. I mean, I had the privilege of traveling down to Pine Ridge Reservation. I think those guys win the distinction of the poorest county in the country. I was neck and neck with Cheyenne River. And those guys, the White Plume family,
White Plume, yeah.
was growing industrial hemp.
Absolutely. Actually, that was one thing that spurred me on with my activism about cannabis, because I was paying attention to them and what they were doing. And I'm like, why is not the White Earth Reservation doing this? If you look at the history, the White Earth Reservation, 1867, it was called the Great Experiment, of where they were going to change us Indians into agrarians, or farmers. And all of these treaties and laws were made to help us become perfect farmers. Why are we not farming industrial cannabis?
Well, let alone food.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, the three basic hierarchies of food, clothing, and shelter can all be achieved from the industrialization of cannabis.
okay. But I just want to say, I'd like to have some squash. I'd like to have some corn.
Right.
I'd like to have some melons. I'd like to have some beans. Besides just eating, because I have tasted that hemp bread, and it's not it's not like my cup of tea. I'd rather have some cornbread. But you go. It's very nutritious, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the nutritional value of it with all the delta 9 omega oils, which is
Wait,
absolutely.
You don't have to get it from fish krill?
Exactly. And if you're not I'm not like my ancestors, really fond of fish, and I think the military ruined that for me. But I remember catching sunfish out of DL with my grandfather Kermit, and actually I think he was the sunfish king of DL. But yeah, your Delta 9 oils, which are very, especially people that are diabetic, very important for maintaining optimal health.
Okay, and so there's industrial hemp to start with, which, I mean, people always, when you start talking about hemp, people say, well, that's marijuana, you can get high. And from what I get, if you have to smoke like a whole bale of the stuff to get high. And by then
Right.
you would pretty much have passed out anyway, because the THC content is so low, right?
Correct. Well, and this is where I have the challenge, because if you look at the history of the decriminalization of cannabis, it was when all of these farmers were believing under good faith they were growing hemp. And then the government declared the Marijuana Tax Act. And I think the word marijuana is very derogatory. It was used to point out the minorities, the Mexicans and the jazz players, the African Americans or the American Africans, whichever you choose. And, how dare those minorities start looking at white women and facing up and looking white men in the eyes. And it was all because of the use of marijuana. So then they passed the Marijuana Tax Act, and then all of a sudden these farmers went to go renew their hemp farming bills. And when they came in, then they're like, oh, you can't grow that. That's marijuana. And it's like, since I've been growing this, it's been called hemp. Even George Washington, in his memoirs to his garden, he was, out of all my hemp, the Indian hemp, make sure you collect every seed.
So he was selectively farming his.
Right. And if you look at the history, George Washington, yeah. And if you look at the history of Indian or India hemp, that was the hemp that was used in the hookahs.
Really?
Really.
Okay, so we're talking about hemp here. I'm talking to Kevin Shores, and so did you tell me that there's 300 and some strains?
Yeah, if I may humbly correct you, let's call it cannabis.
Okay.
I know you're really using the word hemp, and I apologize.
Okay, I'll move on. So is cannabis the technical name?
Well, cannabis is the Latin name for the plant, and there is roughly 300 different strains of the cannabis plant, and each plant can be cultivated to have THC in it, which is the pseudopsychoactive high, the feeling of in euphoria or the high. Basically people just call it the high. And THC, tetrahydrocanol cannabinol, I think is the full name of it. Well, you don't have to grow a cannabis plant to produce high THC. If you wanted to, you could, but it would all depend on what you are going to grow the plant for. If you wanted to grow it for the social or medicinal aspect, you would plant one plant with a 3 to 4 foot area around it. If you're growing it industrially, and also with the plant for medicinal or social use, you would have to trim it because you want the plant to be big and fat and bushy so it creates the buds, the pollination buds. Now, if you're growing cannabis for industrial reasons, every 2-3 inches you plant a plant, and they grow to a height of 15 to 16 feet tall, and that pole or the stalk is where you get most of the material for the cellulose, and the inner core is what's used for the plastique or the plastic-like material.
Or the clothes that like you have on.
Right, the clothes, but unfortunately, right now China has the market on the clothes because they can produce it so quickly and so fast. So ideally, if you wanted to create some store or some production of the cannabis plant, your quickest is, of course, the seeds, because the seeds have all the nutritional value to it. You can make it for bird seeds, cooking, human consumption, the oils,
But possession of the seeds is illegal.
Right.
I mean, in the United States, not in Canada.
No.
Right? And but possession of hemp seed oil hand lotion is not.
Right. Once it's been produced into a product, I think it's 30 tons or 30,
Bunch.
a bunch, a lot of product made from the cannabis plant is imported to the United States every year.
Oh, yeah, there's a huge amount because there's a big market here, but it is another thing that we don't grow domestically.
Right.
And we don't have a domestic hemp industry or a cannabis industry
And that
because
was
largely the DEA and actually the plastics industry, I think, has been pretty aggressive in trying to end run proposals.
right.
It's been for many years, right?
Well, William Randolph Hearst was the first known vocal media mogul that started demonizing the cannabis. He was the one who helped produce Reefer Madness, and he had a bunch of newspapers where he printed all of these made up stories of people going crazy and butchering their family on cannabis or marijuana, but
Isn't
it
that meth? I think it's meth that does those things, right?
right. But then the wood paper mills. I think the ratio is 1 acre of cannabis would produce as much paper as 4 acres of trees. And that's a yearly thing. And the other aspect too is that cannabis will actually leach pollutants out of the soil when you grow cannabis in a plot. So you could leach out all the toxics from the petroleum-based fertilizers and the the fertilizers and the nutrients that they put into the soil just to make it grow. So it would reintroduce the nutrients and leach out the pollutants.
That's what a cannabis plant can do.
Yes.
See, I totally did not know that. I mean, and so we're talking about this now. Some states, Oregon, medical marijuana use is legal, and I think growing up to 7 plants. Washington State has legalized marijuana, right?
Yep. There's 19 states in the country now that have medicinal, and North Dakota actually did legalize the growth of industrial cannabis, but the particulars of growing it is ridiculous. In order to have a profitable crop of cannabis, you're going to need acreage. And the DEA says, yeah, you can grow the industrial cannabis, but you have to have a 6 or an 8 foot fence around your field. It has to be lit or illuminated, lighting. Also, it has to have GPS on it and security. And, what farmer is going to have the fundings to build an 8 foot fence around a 100-acre field?
And have security.
Right.
That does sound a bit punitive, discouraging. We'll go with that.
Right.
So North Dakota has moved into it. I know some other states. Colorado is the most recent too, right?
Right.
And they have medicinal, plus they have cannabis or hemp itself, right?
Correct. Or no. North Dakota.
No, I'm talking about Colorado.
Oh, yes. Colorado does have the medicinal. Sorry. Colorado does have the medicinal, but I don't think they have. I think they're trying to get it on the ballot about the industrial hemp. And that's where I get so frustrated, because I think it should be just a straight across the board cannabis legalization. That they focus too much on this whole medicinal aspect, that people forget about the industrial aspect.
Right. And I think it's certainly some of the historic demonizing has occurred, but I know that, so I know that the Pine Ridge Reservation and the Navajo Reservation both passed ordinances legalizing production of industrial hemp is what they did.
Right.
Not to split hairs on it. I think that those are the only 2 reservations I know, but there might have been some others. Do you know of any other reservations?
Well, I know at our reservation, or the White Earth Reservation, I did give the tribal council a presentation. I think it was 2004 or 2003, and gave them a 3-year plan of how we would be growing in the dough.
So you're suggesting that White Earth Reservation would legalize marijuana or legalize cannabis?
Cannabis across the board, and then have the simplest production can be hemp concrete or cannabis concrete. There we have our building, Maslow's hierarchy: food, shelter, clothing. So there's our buildings. You can also make a press board out of cannabis, where regular plywood has little 3-inch strands, where you could use 4 to 5 foot strands in a press board, making it 3 times as hard. Also, the cannabis board is a natural insecticide. Bugs don't like it.
Really?
Yeah. So those are the 2 simple things. Then you collect the seeds, and you can either use bird seed or food, or you can use it to get oil. You have the oil, you could take it and ferment the oil. There you have biofuels. So then you can grow your own fuel for your tractors to cultivate cannabis. So food, shelter, clothing.
And in this case, you're suggesting it because it would kind of be a niche market.
Oh, absolutely.
And you know, one of the things I always find interesting is that tribal governments, you know, there's a lot of things that they did to tribes historically. You know, I mean, when they went and raided out on Pine Ridge and took the field from the White Plume family,
Right.
tore up their field of DEA. I had interviewed Alex White Plume before, and you know, he pointed out to me that the United States sent out the military, then let the bootleggers on the reservation, let a lot of essentially pedophile priests onto the reservations, right? And then then casinos. I mean, all of those were things that are considered to be vices, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, you propose something like industrial hemp or cannabis, and that's considered to be illegal. And I was kind of like, so it seemed like the DEA turned its eyes through all that other stuff, or do you know what I'm saying?
Right, right.
But so I don't really understand why the federal government doesn't let tribes have an exemption for cannabis.
Well, this goes back to the whole thing of us supposedly being a ward of the country.
That's what you and I are wards of the federal government. I always forget I'm a ward.
Right, and so we are not right in our minds to make, the right decisions on what to do with our land and our entity.
Right, we're not competent.
Right.
We're wards of the federal government, trustees, yeah. Just for those listening in, this is Winona Laduke, and I'm interviewing with Kevin Shores here, and we're just talking about that we're both wards of the federal government. And I wake up every day and I say, oh, that's right, I'm not competent. What's the federal government want me to do? No.
Right, and even though you've been educated at Harvard, that you're not competent enough to make decisions.
Yeah, well, if I was competent, I'd say we should go for cannabis, industrial hemp, and the whole works, because it's a huge market, and whether it's for the seeds that you have for your community, the seeds that you have with this high nutritional value to all the products. I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar, I'm thinking in the billions of dollar industries that we don't have.
Well, even I think it was 1954, Popular Mechanics did a front page story on hemp. And if you look at the etymology of the word hemp, it's a Germanic word for the Latin cannabis. So they're really good at the wordplay, the doublespeak.
Yeah, I know that. Like thermal enhancement, that's what it's called when a nuclear reactor discharges a bunch of hot water into a river. Thermal enhancement is only really good if you're like in a hot tub or in a geothermal hot spring, not when a nuclear power plant discharges it.
Or if you have some naboop on the stove.
Yeah, or something. Heat up your soup. Jibakwe naboob. Heat up your soup. Right, exactly. But yeah, okay. I don't want to sidetrack. But the other thing I just want to say is that I don't know what percentage of the under 25 related arrests on White Earth, but a good percentage of those are marijuana related.
Oh, absolutely. And if you think of the cost for these non-hurtful crimes, that it's ridiculous. And that's one of the biggest challenges too with the whole legalization of cannabis. What do we do with these prison corporations? Are they going to go out of business because 60% of their population is going to have to be released?
60% of the population is in there for drug-related offenses?
Uh,
A chunk, though.
a chunk. I wouldn't say,
But a lot.
specifically a lot.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot, and we should look into that, but I know that there's quite a few. But, let's just get back to, so this is a proposal that you're talking about. And Kevin, you said you proposed this to the tribal government a few years ago.
I think it was 2003.
Interesting.
PowerPoint
that'd be
presentation.
10 years ago.
Yeah,
But who's keeping track?
right.
And but also there's the whole medical use of it. And I know that I had a father who passed away from cancer, and he was in a state in Oregon where it was legal, but he did not choose to. But I thought, if you're sick and that helps your pain, the use of medical marijuana, it has a lot of health benefits.
Well, my history, my own example is that when I was sick, I was using cannabis when I first was diagnosed with my rheumatoid variant disease. And I was using cannabis medicinally to maintain my pain management. And unbeknownst to me, I was given a urinalysis, and the THC showed
up.
The THC showed up in the urinalysis, and then they made a big deal about it and threatened me that I couldn't use it, and so I stopped using it. But all of this time, they were perfectly fine with me supporting the war with my OxyContin use, because we have to keep that opium flow. What is the opium trade? 800% greater since the last war. And so I think they call it hillbilly heroin. They're fine with me taking those, which is damaging to my liver and my kidneys. Yet they're not okay with me using cannabis to manage my pain.
That's a bit perplexing, I would say.
But
Particularly,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
particularly because they don't really. It seems like that VA didn't really have a solution to your problem.
Right, and on the good side, I guess, for 12 years plus, I've been asking the VA if I can have medicinal cannabis, and they've constantly said no. I've even had doctors, doctors from India, mind you, tell me, why would you want such a thing? And I guess he didn't know about the god Shiva bringing cannabis down from the mountain for the people of India. But recently, I've been prescribed Marinol, which is a synthetic THC, which is synthesized, so it's probably petroleum-based, but it's a synthesized THC, which is the tetrahydrocanol cannabinol from cannabis. So
The active thing.
the active ingredients, right, that is used for pain management.
And does that help you?
Yes.
Well, that is good to hear. Because I appreciate the good path that you've taken in life, the good work you've done, and it's a sorrowful thing to have someone in a tough spot because of the military, And then if there's something that helps you, that's a good thing. That's a very good thing.
Right. Well, I've never been the one to let my challenges stop me. I like to use the word challenge instead of problems, because problems kind of have like a negative connotation to it right away. And so if you look at it as a challenge, a challenge is something that can be overcome, and if you're not able to do it alone, then, you ask for help, and that's never been a challenge for me to ask for help, because I know I'm a humane being, and I like to believe that there's more humane beings around that are willing to give of themselves. And this goes back to the teaching of our ancestors, of giving of ourselves.
Minno Bamad is even.
How? Right.
Well, Kevin, I think our time is coming to a close here, and you got any other, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but I just want to give you a couple more moments here to share with our listenership on White Earth. We've talked about everything from the Gulf War to mayoral runs to being a good human to medicinal use of cannabis and cannabis in general as an economic development strategy, and yeah.
Well, I'd like to at some time maybe do a whole show on cannabis because I even have a solution to the clouded land titles on the reservation with the industrialization of cannabis. But as far as, for the audience that's out there and knowing where Niijii Radio, puts out with all the power that they can, and if people can help donate to Niijii Radio so they can boost that power and even hopefully more people can learn of these shows and the lessons taught. But as far as the audience out there, many different tones of skin, many different pigment challenges, and upbringings of differentness, and religions out there. But no matter what religion or color or even sexuality that we are still on this Mother Earth or the world. And as a humane being, we need to be humane with each other. And so I think that if we could at least, in the least, respect each other, just respect each other in everything, which is the teaching of the Anishinaabe people. How can you go wrong if you respect everyone and everything? And if you're able to sprinkle a little bit of love on that respect, more power to you. So that's pretty much my biggest lesson, respect.
Well, miigwech miu. Thank you.
Chi miigwech.
Yeah, thank you for visiting with me here on this getting to be cold day. Gosh, God no Jesus in November. Miigwech.